In the last video we looked at how to repeat things a fixed number of times using a for loop, but what about if you don't know how many times you want to do something? So say for example you wanted to see how many square numbers there are less than 100. So we don't know obviously how many there are, so we can't count using a for loop, but what we could do is use a type of loop called while. So and this is how it works. So while loops have no counter. So for loops had a counter, you said for n or for whatever. You haven't got that with a while loop. So I'm going to create one with a variable. So I'm going to start with x, and then I'm going to say while x times x. So while x squared is less than 100, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print x squared, but I also need, because there's no counter that gets increased automatically, I need to increase x myself. So I'm going to say x equals x plus 1, and to end my while loop I use the command or the keyword wend, so that's a while end. Notice that I've indented the repeated section just as I did with a for loop. So I've started off, I set the value to 1, I'm checking whether the square is less than 100, and if that's true, so if the square is less than 100, I'm going to print the square, I'm going to add 1, so we'll be ready for the next one. Notice in this particular case, this way of doing while, the check is done at the top of the repeated section. So if x squared was already 100 or more, then it wouldn't run at all. So with this particular type of loop, it might run no times depending on the starting conditions. So if I run that now, we'll see what it does is it gives me all of the square numbers up to but not including 100. So sometimes you might need to be a little bit careful with your conditions. So if you wanted to include 100, I would need to change that to less than or equal to 100, so that will give me all the square numbers up to including 100. So that's one way of repeating things if you don't know how many there are. So you can repeat that particular calculation and the printing while a particular condition is true. So while the value of x squared is less than 100. There is another way, a second way of doing while, and it's a thing called a do loop. And I'll just say, it just happens that I've copied and pasted one here, and it's basically the same idea, but you'll see the difference. So the way it works is you've got do at the top and loop. They're the structure that create the repetition, and then you've got the command in the middle. But in this particular type, because the condition is at the end, then it means this type of while loop is always going to run at least once. And if you just have a look at that code, what do you think it's going to do? So it's repeating a number. It's saying, give me a number from 1 to 10, which it stores in the variable x. And then it says, while x is less than 1, or x is greater than 10. So that section is going to repeat while x is less than 1 or x is greater than 0. Now, because x has yet to be used in this program, the initial value of x is going to be 0, but it doesn't matter anyway because the check's at the end, and it will be defined by whatever the person types in. So if we run this program now, basically what this is doing is a form of validation. So it's only going to accept a number in the range 1 to 10. So if we try that then, give me a number from 1 to 10. If I say 0, it's going to ask me again because it's not in the right range. If I say 11, it's going to ask me again because again it's not in the right range. So while my answer isn't in the range 1 to 10, it keeps asking me. And if I type in a number that is in the right range, it no longer repeats and it says thank you. So that's a practical example of how you could use a while loop, but the do loop while form, because the checks at the end, you need it to ask at least once, otherwise there's nothing to check, but that form might be slightly better in this particular case. It looks slightly more complicated, I think. I would tend to use the while wend more often, but they're two useful methods for repeating where you don't know how many times you want to do it, because you don't know when the person's going to give you a number from 1 to 10. You're not sure how many square numbers there are less than 100.